Megan, can you just give me a go ahead that this is like, say something that this is good, that it's working? Oh my goodness. Maybe not. Hold on. What is happening here? Anyway, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to go out of stop sharing because I'm concerned. Start over. Okay. Oh, wait, there's something happening. Oh, having technical difficulties. Need to pause. Oh, no. Video is not running. Okay, we're live. Okay, we're properly live. For real and truly. Wonderful. Okay. Okay, cool. So I'm going to start over again. I know you all have already heard this, but since we do record this and put it on YouTube, I'm going to say everything again, hopefully a little bit more eloquently this time. My name is Laura Green. This is Healthy Poor. I am a licensed professional counselor and a hospitality professional. Start over. Perfect. And a hospitality professional. I've been working in the hospitality industry for nearly 20 years. And eventually I went back to school while I was working in hospitality to get my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling because I found that the industry and culture of the industry was a little bit unhealthy. And by the time I finished, I decided to focus my work around mental health on the hospitality industry and how to hopefully help the individuals who work within it. So a few disclaimers. This is not therapy. This is psychoeducation. Today we are going to be talking about coping mechanisms, specifically how work can be a coping mechanism for individuals. And a little bit of self-disclosure, this is definitely something that I struggle with and probably have struggled with since I was in high school or so. So it's a little near and dear to my heart, as well as it's a little touchy, you know what I mean? It's something that I definitely deal with, but I know that a lot of people in the hospitality industry use work as a coping mechanism, and it's not always super healthy or helpful for individuals. So I think this is a really important thing to talk about. I also think it's important to revisit what coping mechanisms are and go a little bit more in depth about what constitutes a more we'll talk about adaptive versus maladaptive coping mechanisms a little bit, but what constitutes something that's healthy and helpful for you versus something that isn't, especially given the current climate that's happening right now, not only with the COVID pandemic, but especially within the United States, where there are a lot of very profound and traumatic social issues happening, and people are coping, and some people are coping well, some people don't know how to cope or where to go, and some people are not coping super healthily. So this is something that I think is really, really important to talk about right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and go in it. I made a PowerPoint presentation like a dweeb, but we'll walk through it. When I start sharing my screen, I can't see any of the questions come in, so I will be addressing questions at the very, very end. If you do have a question, go ahead and put it in the question spot. And sorry if I'm looking at the screen like this the whole time, because that's just what's going to happen. All right, here we go. Enable screen sharing. Oh, I should also say, if you are watching this and you feel that some of your feelings that come up are a little bit unmanageable for you, you can go to healthypoor.org/if you need help, and there are resources there, crisis chat lines, helplines that you can call, and resources to find a therapist right now that you can utilize. Also understanding that whatever feelings you're feeling are definitely normal, and feelings are certainly our friends, and they're indicators that something needs to be addressed, or something means something to us, or lots of reasons that we have feelings, but whatever you're feeling right now is definitely normal, and you're probably not alone in feeling it. But if that becomes unmanageable, I encourage you to step out and utilize any or all of the resources on the If You Need Help tab. Okay, Here we go. All right. So understanding coping mechanisms, coping with work. Okay, so first, I know we've talked about stress before on this program, but just revisiting, stress arises when individuals perceive, oh my God, this slide, I always forget to delete that one part of the question. It's so embarrassing. Stress arises when individuals perceive that they cannot adequately cope with the demands being made on them or with threats to their well-being. And I added this meme because I identify with it. Working in hospitality isn't stressful at all. Todd, 25 years old. So stress, again, it's all about perception. So what is stressful to one person might not be stressful to another person. We have different things that are stressful in our lives. Some things we've been able to adapt to and they aren't as stressful anymore. But stress is not a one-size-fits-all situation, the same way that coping is not a one-size-fits-all situation, and we'll go into that. So if you're feeling stressed out about something and maybe someone you're close to is not feeling stressed out about that, that's not an indicator of anything. It just means that's something that stresses you out and doesn't stress them out. You might have to do some work to address that stress, which is what coping mechanisms are for, but it doesn't make you bad or them better or anything like that. Okay, so examining stress, causes of stress. Life changes, physical life changes, emotional life changes, and mental life changes. So, maybe you are struck with an illness that will cause stress. Emotional life changes. Maybe you start, you have a child and you are experiencing, postpartum depression or like mental changes. You are going through something especially traumatic or challenging, right? And then of course, challenging situations, which I think we can all identify with right now, and social factors. So large, very like deterministic social factors that can create stress. That is something in particular right now, coupled with the challenging situations of like the COVID pandemic, it's compounding a lot of these feelings of stress, making coping a little bit more challenging. Types of stress. There's acute stress. Acute stress, there's a disorder called acute stress disorder, and that lasts for about no more than 6 months or so. And that is an elevated sense of stress that can result in symptoms of depression, hypervigilance, uneasiness following a specific event. So like, let's say you break up from a partner or you lose a family member and you have, life is a little bit more challenging. You're finding situations more challenging to manage for less than 6 months. That we're looking at acute stress there. Episodic stress is kind of in line with acute stress, but it's when stress is brought on by a single episode and can arise again and again because of repeating those episodes. It's very connected to acute stress. Chronic stress is that constant level of stress. A lot of folks in hospitality will experience chronic stress. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that happens because it's tied into using work as a coping mechanism as well as substance use and other things. But that's sort of like that, that just ongoing feeling of stress. And then there's post-traumatic stress. And the post-traumatic stress is following an incident of some kind that you witnessed something that has caused so much fear and trauma within you that it extends for longer than 6 months, diagnostically, longer than 6 months, and can lead to issues with sleeping, severe hypervigilance. That's when we hear people being triggered, that something can happen that will remind them and it takes them back into that moment. Those are some pieces of post-traumatic stress. And something that we talked about a few weeks ago with Jessica is that it's not, post-traumatic stress is not limited to, we often hear about it with like soldiers going to war. I know that there's a lot of conversations around post-traumatic stress with victims of sexual violence. But post-traumatic stress can be a result of even watching a traumatic video on the internet, watching something on TV that is especially stressful and traumatic. So post-traumatic stress is not reserved for any one type of profession or person. Post-traumatic stress is, I think, more common than we give it credit for, and does not have to be limited to certain situations. So I just want to validate that with folks too. Oh, there's a meme. When you're at work, trying to stay positive. Yeah, pretty much. Okay, so common effects of stress. There are two, as we can see from the slide, there's two areas of this. There's cognitive, so things that are happening emotionally in your brain, and then there's physical, your physiological effects. So your cognitive, hypervigilance, just being a little bit more on edge, increased anxiety, loss of emotional control, like when you're in a stressful situation, you kind of blow up, which also can be considered a coping mechanism. We'll get to that. Mental slowness, because your senses are so high and so focused on just addressing that one stressor, it means your other mental faculties are, not going to be as acutely engaged with what's going on around you. Difficulty concentrating, and dissociation. Dissociation is a big one, especially in really extreme stressful situations, that your brain, as a help to you, kind of turns off and almost erases that bit so as to protect you and your psyche. So physical, increased heart rate, increased adrenaline, increased cortisol, shallow breathing, perspiration, and fatigue. So that's sort of like elevated physical piece where, you're doing some shallow breathing, you might start sweating. You see, like, there's stories of women who will lift their cars to save their children. That's the adrenaline rush. Those are all effects of stress, and those are in place, like how I mentioned with the dissociation. Those are all in place to protect you. So if you are in a stressful situation, from an evolutionary standpoint, like if you see a lion, you're going to want to run away from that lion, and all of those physical pieces happen so that you can get away from that lion. Same thing with those cognitive pieces, like the hypervigilance. You're in a stressful situation, you're on edge a little bit more so that you can get away from whatever that is. Okay, moving on. Coping. So coping is an ongoing process that helps the mind and body mitigate the effects of stressors. And I always like to use this photo from Chernobyl, because in this slide, what he's talking about is all of the fail-safe mechanisms within the nuclear reactor on the show, well, in real life, but you get me. All of the things that are there to mitigate the problems that are arising. So one problem comes in and a mechanism swoops in, another problem comes in, another mechanism swoops in, this one fails, this one swoops in. So there's a lot of factors that are moving in and out all the time while we're coping. So coping mechanisms can be intentional or automatic, meaning we can be very aware of our coping mechanisms and say, like, okay, I'm experiencing stress, I'm going to go engage in this activity. Or it might be something that we are so accustomed to utilize that we automatically go into it. One might be employing defense mechanisms, or, misattributing, or yelling or crying. Those can be considered automatic coping mechanisms. Determining whether coping mechanisms are healthy or not is entirely dependent on the individual. And we'll get into this in a little bit too, but it's just like stress is a perception, coping, and not a one-size-fits-all, coping is not a one-size-fits-all. What could be a really effective and adaptive coping mechanism for one person might be really rough for another person. So that's where, emotional intelligence comes in. That's where, learning yourself and practicing adaptive and healthy coping mechanisms are really helpful, because you can know what works for you then. Okay, so examine coping mechanisms and skills. It's important to know and to embrace that you might not be able to control all of what you experience, but you can control how you react to it. And an example I like to use is a few years ago, I was riding my bike home and there was this other woman in the bike lane with me, and this car came up and cut us off and could very much have like killed us, right? And then the car drove away, and that sucked. And it was like really stressful in that moment, and it was a very close thing. The woman who was with me lost her mind, and she's yelling and screaming, and we both, the light turned green and we both went on our way. And she was yelling and screaming about it for blocks and blocks. And I was like, oh my God, at some point, you gotta stop yelling about it because the car's gone, and if we're just like yelling and putting it out and holding on to that anger with it, it's not going to change the driver and the car's behavior. And it's really just going to keep us angry and mad about it. So, I mean, I obviously never forgot that. And I think about it a lot in terms of how we cope with stressful situations, that we have a choice and we have opportunity to develop how we cope with these stressful situations, and it's up to us to really decide if they're healthy or helpful or not. So the brain and body are constantly seeking ways to cope with stress, meaning if you eliminate a coping mechanism because you're like, not for me, something else is going to find a way into that. So what's something I see a lot in hospitality, and these both lie in the sort of in between, rough coping mechanisms that can go either way. It's like people will quit drinking and then they go really, really deep into exercise, but then that exercise becomes compulsory and it's not serving them and, being very healthy on their body anymore. And so it's just replacing one coping mechanism with another. Alternatively, a lot of people will quit drinking or quit substances and they take on exercise as their primary coping mechanism, but it is very helpful and it is very healthy and they're respecting their body, and it can really go either way. But no matter what, something else is going to swoop in, because your body and mind are working for you to survive. Okay, but within those coping mechanisms, you have three choices. You can confront the stressor in order to grow. You can numb the emotional response and don't grow, or you can repress the whole situation and don't grow. And there are words for those, and those are adaptive versus maladaptive coping. Okay, so adaptive coping mechanisms are those that help us to confront stressors and manage their efforts in ways that do not harm our bodies and minds, right? So exercise is an example. If you push yourself to that sort of like compulsive place, that compulsive exercise, and you are, your body is tired and you have injuries because of the exercise and you still engage in the exercise anyway, that would not be considered adaptive because you're causing harm to your body. That's an indication that maybe it's not super great, but adaptive coping mechanisms, at the core of what those are coping mechanisms that take the stressful situation and then you either change the stressor or you change how you are able to react to it and move within it so that the stress isn't as harmful or scary to your body and mind. And I hope that makes sense. Maladaptive coping mechanisms often relieve the effects of the stressor temporarily, but do not address the root problems or source of the stress. So that's when I talk about like sort of numbing coping mechanisms, like using substances, turning on loud music and not thinking about anything, that those sort of like numbing situations. Now, maladaptive coping mechanisms don't necessarily have to be unhealthy. Sometimes we have experienced something that we do not have the energy or the tools to get to right away to really address in order to adaptively cope. And so those maladaptive coping mechanisms can be really helpful to sort of bide us time until we're able to get to that place that we're able to, grow from our coping mechanisms, or if that makes sense. So it's not necessarily bad to cope with a maladaptive coping mechanism but it gets to be a problem when your only coping mechanisms are maladaptive coping mechanisms because you're never really addressing those situations. Okay, then there's active versus avoidant. Kind of the same situation, but we're getting a little bit more nuanced here. Active coping refers to coping mechanisms that actively address why and how the event is causing stress. So that's when you like dive into problem solving mode. You do a lot of self-reflection to figure out, okay, so this brought on that emotional response, probably because this and this. I'm going to try this next time, and you start processing those things. Those are some active coping mechanisms. Avoidant coping refers to coping mechanisms that ignore the issue or event, even if the individual is aware there's a problem. And avoidant coping is really tough because you might know that there's a problem, like you might know that that's happening, but you're just avoiding the whole situation, maybe numbing it with some maladaptive coping mechanisms, but in your head, you can still know that there's a problem. And that starts to get all tied into like, okay, so I know that there's a problem, I'm gonna cope maladaptively, I'm gonna numb this situation, I'm gonna avoid the whole thing, but it's like that nasty, gross container in the back of your refrigerator that you're not ready to open yet. That's kind of like what an avoidant coping mechanism, that you can clean out your whole refrigerator and then you just pull that dirty thing out and then you put it back in without ever actually cleaning it out or getting rid of it. I hope this is making sense, and I hope as we go through this, you're kind of seeing like, oh, that's something that I do. Oh, yep, that might be maladaptive. I hope you're reflecting on this as we go through as well. Active. So these are some examples of active and adaptive coping mechanism. Problem solving. Problem solving is a great active and adaptive coping mechanism because you can problem solve with the stressor. You can say, okay, so this is the thing that happened, like if you're behind the bar or you're, trying to figure out how to keep your kitchen more organized or something. You can say, okay, well, we're gonna try this, 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 and this, and we'll see if that works. That is a really great way to cope. Or you can say like, okay, so I can't avoid when that car cuts me off on the street. So I'm going to figure out why that got me so riled. Well, probably because I could have died, but also because it was something that I didn't have control of and that was frustrating. And, starting to problem solve within yourself. So problem solving is a really great way to actively and adaptively cope with stressors. Meditation is a really great one because it helps us to have a little bit more control of what our emotional life is. When I first started graduate school, I had a professor tell us that our emotions are like a horse, that if we let the horse just do whatever, we're gonna end up somewhere. At the same time, if we're riding with the horse, if we're working with the horse, if we have a trust situation with that horse, we can go wherever we want quickly. And I always thought that was a really nice way to talk about our emotional life and our relationship with our emotions. They're our friends, they're tools. They help us get to where we need to go. So when you do things like meditate and are able to have more control over your emotions and more steady yourself so that you can examine those emotions a little bit better, it's a really, really helpful coping mechanism for people. I don't mean to get all hippy-dippy, but there's a lot of science behind it at the same time. Meditation. There's also, if you want some like really dope meditative and evidence-based meditation, guided meditation stuff, you should look into, it's I Rest Yoga Nidra by Dr. I think it's Richard Miller. I don't know. I'll find out and I'll share that with you all. I think it's Dr. Richard Miller, but it's called I Rest Yoga Nidra. You listen to it before you go to bed, and it does a lot to help not only relieve stress symptoms, but also helps insomnia, symptoms that are present within post-traumatic stress disorders, and heavily researched, heavily validated, super, super cool. Anyway, moving on. Processing with friends or family or a mental health professional. This is really great because you're able to process what happened, what your reaction was, and then maybe with the help of a friend or family member or professional, develop new ways to cope with that. This can also, and I'll get to this in the in-betweens a little bit too, might turn into something that isn't as helpful, especially when you're processing with friends and family. But we'll get to that in a second. Physical movement is really helpful. When we have these stress responses, it's not just in our brains, it's also in our body. So like finding a way to get that out of you is really, really helpful for a lot of people. I used to date this dude whose mom was a veterinarian who studied animal behavior, and she said when dogs like shake out, it means that they're like getting all their energy out and they're just like kind of coming back to like a more centered place. So she would praise them every time. Every time they would shake, she'd be like, good shake off. And so sometimes if I'm feeling stressed, I'll be like, oh, good shake off. You know, it's because there's something to that, like getting it out of you and taking that energy and putting it somewhere else, like out of your body. Reflection, that can come in the form of journaling, art, writing music, just ways to reflect on what happened, and doing that on your own, whereas processing with friends and family can also be another way to do it. So it's just one or the other. Either one of those is really great. Okay, avoidant and maladaptive coping mechanisms. Denial, like, oh, this isn't happening, this isn't happening, this isn't happening. I think that there's there are a lot of folks that employ denial as a coping mechanism, and you know, it's pretty textbook in the sense that if you don't address the issue, it's not going to go away. It's like that container in the back of your refrigerator. Like there's still rotting food in there, whether you choose to believe that there's rotting food or not. Oh, I'm getting mad. Employing defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms look like misattribution. So someone calls you out and is like, you know, you didn't clean, I don't know why I'm fixated on my kitchen right now, but you didn't clean the kitchen. And you're like, but you didn't clean this, or, you know, pushing it off, or, well, this didn't happen, or this didn't happen, or, you know, it's not my fault, it's this, you know, those are examples of defense mechanisms. Not taking responsibility for things. You know, let's say someone calls you out or even calls you in and you get super, super, super defensive. And I think that this is really relevant right now, especially given the social issues that are happening and people are having conversations around, you know, sort of personal responsibility and accountability within how we interact with each other. You know, it's a very stressful thing to hold on to those defense mechanisms, so they usually will start to mount. There is a release that happens when you own your stuff. So it becomes very maladaptive because you're never really addressing the issue. Substance misuse. And notice here how I put substance misuse, because substance use doesn't necessarily have to be avoidant or maladaptive. But when you're misusing those substances, that's when it starts to become a problem. You know, if you look at something like alcohol is a depressant, right? So if you are feeling really, really, really stressed out and really like all the way up here, and you have a beer and it like chemically will depress you and calm you down, that arguably could be a really helpful way to be like, okay, now I'm centered. Now I can address these issues. So you can look at that as like a maladaptive coping mechanism that can move into a adaptive coping mechanism if you're using it in a way that's healthy, but that's kind of rare. Self-harming behaviors. Self-harming behaviors, when we hear that, I know that a lot of folks immediately think of things like cutting or, you know, like physical self-harm. Self-harming behaviors can also look like staying up all night and binging TV so you don't get any sleep, or binging different substances, like drinking a whole bunch, like a mission to go. High-risk behaviors are other potentially self-harming behaviors. Risk-taking, yeah. Displacement. Displacement's a really fascinating one, because that's when you are, and that's part of like a defense mechanism. It's actually a Freudian thing, which kind of bothers me, but whatever. Displacement is when you are dealing with a situation and you put it off on somebody else. In families, what we see a lot is like, let's say two parents are fighting, but they start triangulating their stress and fighting on the dog or the child or the dishwasher, right? So displacing those emotional reactions and those, feelings of stress would be considered avoidant and maladaptive, again, because you're not confronting them. Hope this is helpful. It kind of stresses me out that I can't see anything. That's fine though. Okay, the in-betweens, which is where we live today. Canceling plans. Sometimes canceling plans is the most wonderful coping mechanism because you need that space in order to deal with whatever stress you are dealing with. When canceling plans becomes maladaptive is when you are feeling, let's say, anxiety around engaging with other people. So that becomes more avoidant then, as opposed to healthy. So canceling plans can really go either way. With all of these in-betweens, as we go through them, I encourage you to think like, if these are things that you employ in your life, when you are employing them, thinking, okay, am I canceling these plans because I need space to process and to sort of decompress and all of this, or am I canceling plans to avoid this sort of situation, to avoid what it'll feel like if I say something silly or something like that? Taking that time to really examine that within yourself. Substance use with friends. This is an in-between because coping with friends and utilizing friends and engagement with other human beings can be a really wonderful coping mechanism to utilize. When that is paired with substance use, that can often move away from adaptive and healthy and helpful coping into maladaptive and avoidant coping, especially when the group of friends or the people who you are with are dealing with the same kind of stresses. And I think a really universal example of this is going out after work and commiserating at the corner bar with the rest of your colleagues. That can be a wonderful source of coping and decompression and processing after work, but all too often it moves into something that's not super great. Exercise. I brought this up earlier. Exercise is, and when you exercise, that releases endorphins and stuff. So like a lot of really feel-good hormones that sometimes we can utilize to avoid the issues that are making us feel a certain way. Compulsive exercise is also tied into, I think I have it next, eating disorders, or just, I should say, disordered eating. Feelings of control, like sort of, and this goes back to those, what's the word? I just said it a few minutes ago, the Freudian one, it doesn't matter. Pushing control off into something else. If something's stressing you out, you don't feel like you have control over something, pushing that kind of control into, how much you're exercising and what you're putting into your body in a way that isn't helpful or healthy for your body is incredibly problematic. So you can see how these are all very they can be really, really great, but they can also be really, really rough. Like taking the night and cooking and feeding yourself healthy food that your body needs and wants and intuitively is drawn towards, that's something different than binge eating junk food while watching The Office on Netflix. Never done that. It's not like I did that on Saturday. No big deal. Venting and valving. So venting and valving can be really, really great because on one hand, there's a feeling of release. So if you're at a high emotional place and you're like, "Whew," and it's gone from you, that's helpful because once it's gone, you might have more space within your emotional life to be able to address the issues that are causing you stress. Unless you are at the bar all the time getting wasted with your colleagues and all you are doing is venting and complaining without any sort of reconciliation of the problem or resolution at all. And then work. And I've been talking this whole time, but work. Work is one that in the hospitality industry, we really struggle with. And this is the last slide, so I'm going to stop sharing. in the hospitality industry, this is something that we really struggle with. And I think my theories on this is the same way as how going out after work and pairing that with substance use is a little bit of a messy situation. I think there are so many people within this industry that thrive within problem-solving coping mechanisms. There's so many folks, especially within the cocktail world, you know, those bartenders who are more meticulous about what they're doing, and the perfectionism of that, perfectionism paired with the problem-solving coping gets a little muddy when our problem-solving is work, right? So we take our problem-solving to cope to go to work. But then that work is an escape from the rest of the world. You know, something that I really miss about bartending is that I could go into a shift for 8 hours and put my phone away, and all I had at that moment, all I really could access was the job, was the service well, was the cocktails that I was working on. Everything else was like outside. And that, by definition, can very much be considered a maladaptive coping mechanism. Oh, my Siri's talking to me. A maladaptive coping mechanism because you are not addressing what other stresses are outside. So if you're avoiding stresses on the outside of work and using work to escape from those, that would be a maladaptive coping mechanism. But again, it's tied up in a big way to a problem-solving coping mechanism. So you can kind of see how that gets a little bit challenging. And at this point, I think I'm going to open it up to questions because that was a lot, and I also very much want to check in with people. Oh, I wish I had water. I didn't get any water. Before I talk a little bit more about work as a coping mechanism and how to identify, you know, when it is a coping mechanism and when it's just your job. Because that also involves work-life balance and stuff, which is a whole other thing. But I'll give it a second. Are there any questions? I'm going to say no. Cool. So when we look at utilizing work as a coping mechanism and taking on 17-hour work days all the time and that becoming the norm, that means that there are so many other issues outside of our working life that aren't necessarily being addressed, especially if we're using coping work as coping to escape those issues. So then when we find ourselves in situations like this, where we're all home and we don't have a work to go to, that can become really, really challenging because you're forced in a lot of ways to address those issues that you were using work to avoid, right? So then you're experiencing those. And I think in this time, a lot of people have taken their more free time to reassess what their coping mechanisms are, but a lot of people have also then replaced their coping mechanisms with other ones like substance use or exercise, you know, and whether those things are healthy for them or not is going to be up to them. But as people, one of the reasons I wanted to do this topic is as people go back to work slowly but steadily over the next few months, that's going to be a little bit shocking, first of all, from a scheduling standpoint, from a life structure standpoint. But I encourage you all to be mindful of if you're using work as a coping mechanism or if it's problem solving, and taking time to sit down with yourself to understand those differences. Are you using work to avoid something or some, a space? Like, do you not want to be home? Or, what does that look like? Because ultimately, I want to see folks, work lives and the relationship with their work to be a healthy relationship that enriches their life and increases their life satisfaction, as opposed to completely taking over their lives. Which I think when we talk about like work-life balance, I think it's a problematic term, mostly because it prioritizes work and asks you to fit your life into that work, where I would like to see more models around choosing what our life looks like, and then having our work fit into our life, and like definitely pushing more of a life satisfaction vibe out there. So yeah, I mean, it comes down to really what we've been saying through this whole series of Healthy Core, of like taking time with yourself, you know, having some maybe challenging conversations with yourself, and using those conversations and that individual reflection and processing to help you grow so that your working life is healthier and happier. That is what I have. It's 3:45. Does anyone have any questions? Was this helpful? How'd you like the PowerPoint? It was nice. It was nice and green. Oh, something's not working. And again, if you, as you move through your day, if you do need additional assistance to help yourself manage any of these feelings, go to healthycore.org/if you need help, or just healthycore.org, and you can see that at the top with resources. Yeah, and I hope you all are doing well. If this was stressful for you, shake it out. It's a good shake off. Yeah, take some time, maybe practice a new coping mechanism now. Maybe write down a few words that you're feeling. You know, sometimes just writing things down is really helpful to just name what it is you're feeling, and that's a really helpful and effective coping mechanism as well. If you have any questions for me, you can always reach out at Laura@healthycore.org. I'm really behind on emails, so I'm very, very sorry, but I am getting there. Here's a question. It's taking a minute. Are there any tips you can give us to start recognizing when we are using work as coping mechanism? For example, you get more short-tempered, etc. Yeah, so one way to start identifying if you're using work as a coping mechanism is if it's the only place you want to be, but not in a happy way. It's not like you're like, I want to go to work because I want to do this and this and this and this and this. You know, it's more like you feel like a compulsion to go to work. You feel guilty when you're not at work, or you know, you want to go to work, or you go and sit at your bar at work. You know, when you're just at home, that's when you might know that you might have an unhealthy work relationship. You know, those are some solid indicators. If you're starting to feel symptoms of burnout at work because you're not actually, burnout comes when you don't feel like you're actively working towards something a lot of the times. So if you start feeling cynical around work, but you're working 80 hours a week, that might be a thing. Like if you're not forced to be there 80 hours a week, you know, if it's a tough one, and this is why it's an in-between one, because I was talking with someone that was like, I'm working 17-hour days, 3 days in a row. And it was with a sense of pride on one hand, but also with like flickers of disdain at the same time. And I was like, that's a really interesting thing. They're angry about being there, but they're also proud about being there. And that tells me that there is some sort of a problematic relationship with the work life, that it's probably being utilized as a coping mechanism in some way. Trying to think of other ways, you know, of getting more short-tempered, certainly, because that also means, okay, here's another thing. If you're using avoidant coping mechanisms, your area in which you have to work in a fruitful way, and not working just like, not working necessarily like behind the bar or on the line or anything like that, but you're, if you look at this as like two walls, right? Like in Star Wars, you know, when it's the trash compactor's coming in, if you are avoiding your stress, right, or you're just completely not addressing and denying it at all, the walls of where you can function in a way that you can control, they're getting smaller and smaller all the time. If you address them, you have more space there. So if you have stresses that are compounding all over the place and they're not being addressed, that's when your short fuses really start to come up, because you don't have that space to work with it. So that tells me it might be you might be utilizing work as a maladaptive coping mechanism, but it tells me whatever it is, you're overwhelmed. If you are having those short fuse tempered moments all the time, you are overwhelmed with stress in other ways, and it might be time to start really addressing and writing down, like, these are the things that are stressing me out, and one at a time if you can, or whatever works for you, starting to pick away at those and figuring out how to address those. Diana, I hope that is helpful, and I hope that answered your question. Yeah, that trash compactor of stress that's a bit of a rough one. Oh wait, hold on, I gotta scroll down. Okay. It did, thank you. Beautiful. All right, everybody. Love the PowerPoint. Wish I could keep it with me to refer to. You know what? I'm gonna put that PowerPoint up on healthypoor.org. That's not, oh, and also there's a really great, I don't have it. There's a really great thing that I did with a new friend. If you go to, I think Studio Atau, I did a whole series with Jenny Dorsey, Chef Jenny Dorsey, and she organized my thoughts, she's a saint for it. But we did a whole guide to coping mechanisms together. So, we talked through what coping mechanisms are, and she organized it into what she calls a community skill share. And she did such a great, it is so beautiful. Like, it took the chaos in my brain and organized it on a paper, and I was just like, that is extraordinary. And there you can also find a Therapy 101 that I did with her if you want to learn more about therapy. I will put links to that up on Healthy Poor hopefully this weekend, so that you can access those as well. But those are really great resources. She did a really beautiful job. But yeah, I hope you all are hanging in there. It's a wild time, but yeah, take care of yourself today. If there's anything else, I'm gonna log off, and I'll see you next week. We'll be talking about work and boundaries. So expanding on this content a little bit more, and talking about boundaries within relationships at work, how to create healthy work-life boundaries. So Diana, that's one that I would definitely tune into, because we'll be going a little bit more into work as a coping mechanism and how to create boundaries around that if you need to. All right, that's all I got. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and I'll see you next week. Bye.